Hi, in this presentation we're going to be examining the relationship between culture, ideology, and the environment. So I want to start by thinking about what culture is in a kind of broad and general sense, and a kind of catch-all definition, probably inadequate, but will work for now, is a system of language, customs, beliefs, values, norms, and behaviors passed from one generation to the next. And all cultures have two parts to them: that which you can see, which we call material culture; that which you cannot, that is the non-material culture. And as it turns out, much of what we'll be interested in will be in the non-material realm in terms of people's attitudes, values, and beliefs. But what's interesting about culture is how infrequently we reflect upon it and think about its absolute grip on us as individuals and shaping who we are as individuals, what we become, and what we'll do with our lives. So we're going to go from here, kind of breaking culture down into some of these smaller pieces. So let's start with beliefs, and these are simply ideas, right, about ourselves, about the world, about our own lives. For instance, many cultures used to believe the world was flat, and that was a false belief, but it didn't matter. It was a belief that was shared across people, and its reality, even though it didn't match what was happening in the world, was a reality for those people living in that culture. So there's a kind of relative quality to all this that will pop up as we discuss it. Values build upon beliefs by adding some emotional content, and that shapes what we view as desirable, what we want, what we like, and of course the flip of that, what's offensive, repulsive, and so on. These are all very specific to our culture, and as you of course look from one culture to the next, you can see quite a bit of variability in terms of what people find to be desirable or undesirable. And then based on our beliefs and values, we form attitudes, which are specific opinions that are filtered through those beliefs and those values. Now we're moving more towards the realm of behavior. So far we've been talking about ideas, values, and attitudes, which are things that sort of exist at a cognitive level in the individual and are shared in a group of people or a society, a culture. So our norms are expectations or rules for behavior. These can be formal in the shape of laws or policies, or they can be informal, in which case you don't always know they're there. But the way we know that these expectations or rules exist often is when we violate them. And so that's where we run into what we would call a sanction. So all cultures have ways of controlling its members. These social control mechanisms are both formal and informal. If you break a law, you get a formal social control. There's a known consequence for that. You might go to jail, you might pay a fine, something like that. And then there's, of course, informal ways of enforcing norms. And these might be just a dirty look, kind of an angry remark, or a positive reinforcement, right? People might say, good job, well done. So these are all forms of what we call sanctions, which are just methods of either positively or negatively enforcing the norms. And finally, when we take all those previous concepts and put them together, we develop an ideology, which is a system of beliefs, values, attitudes, and norms that act as a social control. So this is going to be the key idea, ideology. And as we think about the environment, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how ideology, the system of beliefs, values, attitudes, and norms, where they come from and how they influence and shape environmental outcomes. So our next step is going to involve diving into the specific ideological systems that inform the way we think about the environment, and specifically environmental domination. So environmental ideologies will speak to the question, where do cultures get ideas about the environment? And then environmental socialization has to do with us as individuals, how do we come to be indoctrinated to care or not care about the environment? And that's actually a question we'll pursue more in the next presentation. For now, we're going to focus more on the first part of that, and that's looking at the level of culture. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Lynn White hypothesis, which claims religion is a major factor in shaping our thoughts about the environment and nature, and telling us that we have a right to dominate nature. So Lynn White proposed that Christianity is an anthropocentric ethical system, which essentially places humans above nature, at the center of nature, and it views God and the saints, all the sacredness of the world, to be also transcendent and above nature. And to support that, Lynn White cites specific excerpts in text from the Bible and biblical quotes that kind of show this notion of humans as the rightful exploiter of nature. He also discusses how Christianity has historically been at odds with science, and the church has had its run-ins with science, executing people at times, and so forth. Current debates surrounding genetic engineering, stem cell research, the teaching of evolution or creationism in the classroom, and then, of course, historically, the scientific challenge to the church's position that the planets and the sun rotated around the Earth, this kind of Earth-centered solar system, geocentrism is the fancy term for that, was challenged by the church. And so there's always been this kind of tension between science and religion, and Lynn White really puts a lot of blame on Christianity for giving us ideas of domination over the environment as a result. Is it a fair claim? Critics say that Lynn White's views aptly describe only what's going on in parts of the Western world, that this is not necessarily representative of all Christianity, that this is a very diverse religion, actually, geographically and ideologically. If you look at the different sects and denominations of Christianity, people have different beliefs. And the critics also point to other portions of biblical texts that tend to promote an image of responsibility and respect for nature, so maybe claiming that Lynn White was not looking at all the representative views of Christianity. Moreover, if we look at Eastern religions, we do see doctrines that are more favorable to nature, such as Taoism's Wu Wei principle, which is the idea of working with nature. And of course, a lot of Buddhist beliefs emphasize a harmonious relationship with nature. But as critics point out, many of the parts of the world that practice these religions have their fair share of environmental problems, so that perhaps religion itself is not as important as Lynn White was implicating. Other scholars have said it's not religion, it's individualism that's to blame. And they suggest that Western cultures tend to emphasize individuals over the wider community, and that implicitly encourages a form of anthropocentrism, again, placing people above or at the center of the world. And that doesn't prepare us to see our interconnections to nature, the way our bodies are connected to nature, for instance. And we therefore ignore the consequences of our actions for the environment. And the other side of that, we ignore how the environment could be impacting our health. So there's this kind of relationship between individualism and the body, and these ideas are associated with philosopher Bakhtin, who claimed that individualism deeply influences the way we regard the main medium for how we're connected to the environment, and that's our body. And he points to the fact that in Western cultures, bodily functions are often viewed as vulgar, repulsive, dirty, and that historically important people distinguish themselves by separating their body further from nature. And if you look at classic images of royalty being carried above the ground, for instance, that their feet don't even touch the soil, they are the most removed from nature. And then, of course, those on the lower end of the social spectrum are the toilers, the cultivators, the people whose hands are constantly in the dirt, are the lowest in society. So there's a whole kind of argument here that in Western culture, the closer you are to the nature, the less important or valuable you are to society. It's an interesting idea. Certainly not the only. Other critics point to the role of patriarchy, or the idea that this male-centric ethic that exists in Western cultures is also connected to the way we treat the environment. This kind of idea that patriarchy encourages a dominationist idea towards women, and women, because they're more closely tied to nature, are therefore the objects also of domination. And so women, of course, are more associated with the realm of reproduction in the domestic sphere, while men are more associated with production in the public sphere under a patriarchal system. And this all kind of speaks to the domination of men over women, privileging men, and so forth. And if we look at the language we use to talk about nature, there's some interesting connections here to patriarchy, because we tend to use very feminine terms to describe nature. Virgin forest, we talk about fertility of the soil. Some people refer to the abuse of the environment as raping the land. So these are all highly sexualized and gendered terms and images. And then, of course, positive side of that, Mother Nature, Mother Earth. This is all kind of very much pointing to women as being associated with nature. So ecofeminism is a challenge to this kind of patriarchal view, this kind of notion that men are above women and so forth. And ecofeminism doesn't necessarily blame men for environmental problems. It blames the system, but it also acknowledges that women have played a part in this system as well, that it's not just men who are creating this system of patriarchy. And so there's efforts to reshape our thinking about gender, sexuality, and the environment to promote a more egalitarian view. And then finally, we have a contrast between rational utilitarianism and Romanticism that we'll be discussing next. And the idea behind rational utilitarianism is the idea that the environment receives all of its value from exchange, essentially. So if we can assess value of a forest, it's because we can sell the timber on a market for a certain value. And these are the ideas associated with a historical figure, Gifford Pinchot, who played a part in developing the United States Forestry Service. And an important point here is that the environment under rational utilitarianism does not have inherent value. So in other words, if we can't extract any kind of economic worth from environmental resources, then the environment has no value. And that, of course, will influence an ideology of domination. So non-economic values about the rights and beauty of nature, or just appreciating the aesthetic quality, are not part of rational utilitarianism, but this notion of environmental management, of harvesting the resources, essentially treating forests like farms, is all sort of part and parcel related to this. So the opposite of that is Romanticism, the idea that the environment does have inherent worth, that the rights and beauty of nature are the central focus. And these are the ideas associated with figures such as John Muir or James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote extensively about the aesthetics of nature and the importance of experiencing nature to individuals' health and well-being. And of course, this ideology promotes preservation rather than domination. And so policies of nature, preserving nature, keeping it pristine, and these are more important than managing the environment. In fact, there's quite a dictum against that, the idea that managing the environment could actually be creating more problems than we're solving. From the above discussion, we see that there are a lot of different cultural trends or themes going on that promote an ideology of domination. But what a lot of social scientists and other scholars who conduct social research have discovered is that there's been a growing shift in the direction of environmental concern. And it certainly hasn't been a one-way shift. There have been ups and downs, but generally speaking, people in the Western world and around the world, in fact, have become more concerned about the environment. And so we need to explain why and how that's happening. And this research actually goes back to the 70s, around the time of the environmental movement taking shape. And Ronald Engelhardt, who conducts the World Values Survey, started to see this shift of environmental values and concern. And he described this as a shift from a materialist set of values, where people are concerned about their own economic and physical well-being, to a post-materialist set of values, where there's more emphasis on, I guess, less material things. Right? Emphasis on freedom, self-expression, quality of life, spiritual enlightenment, maybe, all these kinds of things. So the goals associated with those values are going to be very different. If you value the material world, then you're going to care more about the economy, maybe, maintaining order in the nation, fighting rising prices, right? Inflation and that kind of thing. Post-materialist goals, completely different set of circumstances. We're going to want to protect free speech. We're going to want to give people more say in government. And we're going to give people more opportunities to explore who they are individually, and so on. In roughly the same time frame that Engelhardt was discovering these post-materialist values, Riley Dunlap and his colleagues were also finding this kind of shift, and they suggested that people were starting to see themselves as more connected to ecology. In other words, not exempt from environmental processes and other types of issues. And so they describe this as a paradigm shift. We're going from a human exemptionalist paradigm, where humans are able to overcome environmental limits through technology and solve most of our problems in such a way. And so the goal of human society is therefore technological mastery. And so if we're having a paradigm shift, we're moving away from those beliefs. Maybe that means we're understanding that technology has limits. And we're moving towards a new ecological paradigm, which is the view that humans are simply one species of many living in nature, and that we need to maintain a balance with nature, living within limits, and realizing the interconnectedness of the world. And more recently, ecological modernization theorists such as Arthur P.J. Moll and his associates have argued that we're moving towards ecological rationality, or the idea that environmental problems are starting to be viewed as something important and to be addressed by our social institutions and our everyday practices. And that happens at all levels, from the individual all the way up to different organizations. And economic and technological order of society, therefore, will need to consider ecological rationality. So whether we call this post-materialism, the new ecological paradigm, or ecological rationality, the same basic idea is in place, that we are reshaping our daily practices through new sets of beliefs and values and attitudes. There are new norms coming into place based on those, and with that, new types of social control mechanisms. And so it's starting to become cool, I guess, to buy green, right? And, that wasn't the case 40 or 50 years ago, perhaps. But this kind of new set of environmentally informed beliefs and values and attitudes are creating a new world. And this is all sort of a cultural process. What the social research tends to show is that environmental concern is not going anywhere. It's been around now for over 40 years in a widespread sort of way. So this isn't a fad that's going to just pass along. It's one of the most lasting social issues of our time, actually. So this is very widespread, but it does vary quite a bit from person to person. And of course, the level of intensity, the extent to which individuals are individually concerned about the environment, it varies quite a bit. But when we look at the overall culture, we can see that where there are times of increasing concern, they're often followed by periods of subsiding concern or even apathy or disengagement. And so one of the explanations for that is something called compassion fatigue, where essentially the public becomes unable to maintain their level of concern and engagement over a period of time. So this could happen as a result of boredom. People just get tired of hearing about the issue. It could result from the media shifting gears as they look for new and novel stories to keep their viewers engaged. It could come from a kind of hazy sense of solution, or the realization that solutions are so costly they're not likely to be implemented. Or could be from a sense that the government is handling the situation and that things are taken care of and no longer require so much public concern or involvement. One of the biggest criticisms of this growth of environmental concern and activism in the last 40 years is the notion that it's a concern for people who are liberal, white, and extremely well off. And research that has tested that hypothesis does not find support for that. Some of the biggest opponents of environmental concern were in fact those with the highest incomes. Privileged groups therefore tend to have less support for environmentalism than do other groups, and concern is highest among women, people of color, and people with lower incomes. So kind of the opposite actually of what that concern suggests. And it makes sense because the poor and women and people of color are often the targets of environmental problems, right? And what we call environmental bads. There is an unequal distribution of environmental bads, and those groups tend to bear the brunt of that. So what we're seeing now is, especially since the 80s and 90s, growing awareness of environmental justice issues, which fuse together environmental concerns with broader social justice issues. So, but the upshot is there's a little support for the assumption that the poor are not concerned about the environment. So as we wrap up our discussion of culture and the environment, I think it's important to reflect on the three key ideas here. And the first one being that our ideology matters because it can help or hurt the environment by encouraging different types of behaviors and actions. If our ideology tells us the environment is just a set of resources, well, then our actions will likely become exploitative. If our ideology tells us that the environment has inherent value, then our actions may be to protect and preserve the environment. So our behaviors and our ideas are connected. So then the next important point is, where do we get our ideas from? Where did we come to form our beliefs, and where did we get our values about the environment? And we examine the roles of religion, individualism, patriarchy, and rational utilitarianism as all cultural trends or themes that have encouraged this ideology of cultural domination. And then we looked at the fact that, fortunately, those ideas have been shifting, that we are now developing new ways of thinking about ecology, ecosystems, the environment, and this has been described as a shift to post-materialism, to a new ecological paradigm, or to ecological rationality. And now we need to focus in our next presentation specifically on how individuals at an individual level come to form such a wide and varying degree of concern and action for the environment. Thanks for watching.